off.
All right.
Okay. Okay, we're set back up again, and excited to have, again, another remote presenter, Holly Holt from the Monarch joint venture. And Holly has been involved in developing a national Monarch monitoring framework. This is also a project that has been involving the Monarch Conservation Science Partnership, sorry. And those of you who were at our last meeting, you may recall that Wayne Thogmartin had presented about some of the modeling work that the Monarch Conservation Science Partnership is doing. So this fits in, or at least from my perspective, fits into all of that work that's being done. So again, Holly will be presenting on that. She's a graduate from Penn State in 2015 with a PhD in entomology. She studied infectious diseases, specifically of honeybees, and she's now the science coordinator at the Monarch Joint Venture. And Monarch Joint Venture is a partner organization. There's over 50 groups currently that are promoting monarch conservation through research, habitat restoration, education, and outreach. And Monarch Joint Venture puts on a lot of great webinars. They have a lot of great resources on their page that we've borrowed into our online library as well. So again, a great resource there. So Holly, I'll turn things over to you.
All right. Hi, everyone, and thank you, Iris, for that introduction. It's really a pleasure for me to remotely be there to talk on behalf of the Monarch Joint Venture and the Monarch Conservation Science Partnership, or the MCSP, and you'll be hearing me using that acronym a lot today. So today I'd like to tell you about ongoing efforts to develop a large-scale monitoring program to track monarchs and their habitat, and I'd like to talk about resources that are available to right-of-way habitats as well, and future steps that right-of-way habitats could take in terms of participating in this monitoring program. But first, I'll be giving a little bit of background for context. And I apologize, I've been on the road, so I haven't been able to attend many of the talks. So if there's some repetition of background, I hope you'll bear with me. Okay, for today's talk, we'll start with reviewing the monarch migratory life cycle. We'll then talk about evidence for monarch population declines and discuss contributing factors. And then we'll discuss steps that we could take to reduce these troubling trends of monarch declines, including the development of a large-scale monitoring program and opportunities for rights-of-way entities to get involved. And finally, I'll just discuss some additional resources available to those that manage right-of-way habitats that offer guidance on best management practices to promote pollinator habitat. And I'm aiming for this talk to be about 30 minutes, and hopefully it'll be about 10 minutes at the end for answering questions. So to start off, many of you have probably heard about the spectacular journey that monarchs make every year. Monarchs have a multi-generational migratory life cycle that spans 3 countries from Mexico to the US and parts of Canada. I'm just going to pause here and ask, can you guys see my mouse pointer moving on the screen? Okay, well.
Okay, yes, we can. Sorry.
Okay, great. Okay, great. When I had the red dot, it wouldn't let me flip through slides. All right. So as I was saying, monarchs have a multi-generational migratory life cycle. And monarchs in North America generally follow 2 major migratory routes, which are roughly delineated by the Rocky Mountains. And you can follow along the monarch's migration route with the map on the left and the stages of the life cycle on the right. And east of the Rocky Mountains, monarchs overwinter in enormous, dense clusters in the forested mountains of central Mexico, and this is shown as the red dot on the map, and the picture of the overwintering colonies in the bottom right-hand portion of the slide. In the spring, these clusters disperse, and monarchs mate, and they migrate north to the southern portion of the U.S., where they lay eggs on milkweed, which is an essential host plant for caterpillar development. And as you can see on the map, monarchs dispersing from Mexico populate the lower orange portion of the U.S. And their offspring reach adulthood and migrate as far north as Canada, laying eggs en route, producing a 3rd generation. And then, in the late summer, a 4th generation emerges and migrates all the way back down to Mexico. And this is a journey up to 4,500 kilometers at its longest distance. And along the way, monarchs build up fat stores by feeding on nectar sources, which you can see over here on the right, and they form temporary roosts in trees. So west of the Rocky Mountains, monarchs also follow a migratory pattern, but the number of monarchs west of the Rocky Mountains is smaller than the number of monarchs east of the Rocky Mountains. In the west, monarchs overwinter in tree stands along the California coastline, as this is shown as this red outline on the map here. And in the spring, monarchs disperse east and north and hopefully amplify their population numbers through multiple generations during the late spring and summer. And as someone pointed out from the last talk, I'd like to pause here and note that monarchs have specific habitat needs as shown by the life cycle circle on the right. Caterpillars, of course, require milkweed to complete their development, but adults require nectar from a variety of blooming plants to fully sustain their summer breeding activities. And nectar availability is also absolutely essential to fuel fall migration. So in this talk, when I'm referring to monarch habitat, I'm referring to both milkweeds and blooming nectar plants. And as a final note, it's really important to mention that monarchs have specific overwintering microclimates that they need as well, but that's not the focus of this talk. So because monarchs are tri-national travelers and they pass this family business along from one generation to the next, you might be wondering how we know that monarchs are in decline. And monitoring monarchs across their annual tri-national range is an enormous task, and fortunately for all of us, there are a number of citizen science and other butterfly monitoring programs that cover nearly every aspect of the monarch life cycle through time and space. And as you can see from the list on the right and the acronyms overlaid on the monarch life cycle on the left, these programs provide information about monarchs and their annual migration. And there really isn't time to talk today about each one of these programs, but I'd like to draw your attention to the bottom of the slide. Down here, let's see if I can get the mouse back. Here it is. So I'd like to draw your attention to the bottom of the slide where you can see that there are two programs that monitor monarch butterfly overwintering populations in Mexico and in California. So CONAMP and the WWF Telcel Alliance monitor monarchs in Mexico, and the Citizen Science Thanksgiving Monarch Count, or TMC, run by the Xerces Society, tracks monarch populations in California. So if we look at overwintering data collected by these organizations for the last 2 decades, we can unfortunately see that both eastern and western monarch populations have suffered significant declines. And just to orient you, the graph gives estimates of monarch overwintering population size in blue for the eastern population and in yellow for the western population, and time is presented on the x-axis. And because monarch colonies in Mexico are enormous, it's impossible to count individuals, and instead the cumulative area occupied by monarchs is measured in hectares, as shown as on the right-hand y-axis for the blue line. And note that in the winters of 2014 and 2013, shown down here, the eastern migratory population reached recorded all-time lows of approximately 1 hectare. And now if I can just direct your attention to the yellow line representing the western monarch population, since this western population is smaller, its total population size across all colonies in California is annually estimated as a count, and this is given on the left-hand axis here. And so looking at this graph, you can see that there's quite a bit of stochasticity in both population estimates. You might also note that the eastern population jumped to 4 hectares this past winter, up from an all-time low of about 1 hectare for the last 2 years. And the good news that we can glean from this sort of fluctuation is that if conditions are favorable, monarchs can respond rapidly since they have multiple generations per year. However, there's also bad news. And according to a recently published population viability assessment, this bad news is that the eastern monarch population has an overall negative growth, meaning that basically it's shrinking. And based on the best available data, taking fluctuations into account, the study projected that the chances that monarch populations would dwindle to such a small level that the migratory phenomenon would collapse. And so looking forward in time, they made these projections. And the sobering findings of this study were that across a range of scenarios, monarchs had a greater than 20% median risk of going extinct within the next 2 decades. And to phrase it another way, according to the study's findings, monarchs meet IUCN criteria for being listed as endangered. And as many of you know, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services is currently evaluating evidence for listing monarchs. So what can we do to mitigate these declines? Well, in order to reduce but not abolish the chance of the migratory phenomenon going extinct, the same study recommended boosting the overwintering population to 6 hectares. And this increase in population size will help buffer monarchs against the many stressors that they face. And for example, here's a brief case study of why we need larger monarch populations. And you recall from earlier slides that the eastern monarch population rose to 4 hectares this past winter, which was great news. But unfortunately, there was a March winter storm, which has now been dubbed the St. Patrick's Day storm, that passed through some of the colonies and the monarch's migratory flight path in the early spring. And we know from previous experience that winter storms can really be pretty devastating. And the St. Patrick's storm hit overwintering grounds after the monarchs had begun migrating. So we don't know what % of the monarchs were left in the overwintering grounds, but we do know that a lot died. And unfortunately, it's not too hard to imagine what a storm like this might have done to the monarch population in previous years when the eastern monarch cumulative population was approximately 1 hectare in size. So this is a great example for why having a larger population approaching 6 hectares is really important to buffer monarchs against stressors. And speaking of stressors, severe winter storms, which may become more frequent because of climate change, are not the only things that monarchs have to worry about. I'm sure many of you in this room are very familiar with all the stressors that pollinators face, and many of the stressors listed here are not unique to monarchs. They also affect bees and flies and other pollinators. So if we just glance at this list, we can see that it encompasses factors from man-made issues like loss of breeding habitat at the top all the way down to natural stressors like predation pressures. And studies are currently working to examine the relative contribution of these stressors, but we do know, as previously mentioned, that loss of milkweed from the U.S., especially from the Corn Belt region, is contributing to monarch declines. And we know this from isotope studies that were conducted in the early 90s, and that a large % of the monarchs that overwinter in Mexico originate from the Corn Belt region. But with the advent of herbicide-resistant crops and widespread adoption of glyphosate, milkweed has all but been eliminated from within agricultural fields, with smaller declines noted in non-agricultural habitats. And in fact, there is a study published in 2013 that found that this loss of milkweed from landscapes represents a loss of breeding habitat for monarchs, and it's significantly correlated with the eastern population's decline. So I've highlighted loss of milkweed as an important factor related to monarch declines, and I've done this in part because it's a man-made change that we can potentially reverse. But it's also important to recognize that there are many stressors that negatively affect monarchs, and unfortunately these factors can interact with each other. So because these stressors operate on a landscape level and fluctuate over time, conducting a threats analysis on a trinational level to identify the best conservation practices is really challenging. So I'm just going to present a schematic here for talking about the best ways of identifying conservation practices, and that is we really need a systems approach to conservation that knits together information across threats, across research techniques and questions, as well as across time and space. And these integrative analyses can flow together to guide development of conservation recommendations, such as restoring habitat. And once conservation recommendations are generated, they have to be effectively communicated to all stakeholders to get commitment to actually enacting these changes on the ground and to produce positive outcomes. So this is a monumental task that many individuals, including all of you in the room, are engaged in. And then a final step in the systems approach is to assess the effectiveness of conservation actions to make sure that ongoing conservation efforts are having the desired effect. So from all the talks that you've been hearing today and from earlier, I'm sure yesterday, there are lots of groups that are taking systems approaches to monarch conservation. And today I just wanted to highlight the work from one of these groups, which is the Monarch Conservation Science Partnership. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the MCSP is a consortium of scientists and conservation professionals that are affiliated with academia, government agencies, and NGOs. And the MCSP was formed in the fall of 2014, and you can see a photo of several of the members from our last meeting this February in Fort Collins. So Working together, the MCSP has produced several products, including the Population Viability Assessment outlined earlier. And to remind you, this PVA produced a conservation target of 6 hectares for the eastern overwintering population. And to help reach this target, the assessment suggested restoring monarch breeding habitat, or in other words, adding milkweed to the U.S. landscape. So how much milkweed do we need to add to the U.S. landscape to reach the 6-hectare target? Well, using citizen science and other data, the MCSP estimated that we need to add a lot of milkweed to the U.S. landscape. And in fact, we need to add about 1.4 billion stems, which is a lot of milkweed. And of course, when we start talking about billions of stems, all sorts of questions arise, such as, where are we going to put all this milkweed? For example, we could put it in CRP lands, marginal croplands, right-of-way habitats, protected grasslands, unprotected grasslands, and even urban and suburban spaces. And the success of placing milkweed in these different land sectors will depend on the rate at which each sector adopts restoration practices and the geographic location of each restoration site. So, for example, because of their complex life cycle, restoring milkweed in some geographic regions is likely to have a larger positive impact on monarch populations than restoring milkweed in others. So keeping these considerations in mind, the MCSP conducted an analysis of where milkweed could be added to the U.S. landscape in order to reach conservation goals. And I'm not going to go through the figure on the right in the slide in detail, but I'd just like you to note that right-of-way habitats have been included in this analysis as the gray circles. And the takeaway message overall from this figure is that we really need all hands on deck in order to reach projected conservation targets. Some additional products from the MCSP include a threats analysis. The MCSP has also produced a milkweed calculator tool, which is freely available online for download. And this tool estimates the amount of milkweed available within a given county. But it's really important to note that these densities are extrapolated from available data because we don't have comprehensive data from everywhere. So to download this tool, you can Google USGS and milkweed calculator, or you can visit the website that's here on the slide. I'll just give you a second to write that down. All right, and so finally, based on available data, the MCSP has developed a conservation priorities map for the nation, weighted according to the eastern and western monarch population sizes. But we can also zoom in on regions and look at regional conservation priorities, for example, looking at the western population. However, as we look at the national scale and consider these products, it's important to note that analyses and projections that I've been talking about are based on the best available data. And recall from earlier that a number of citizen science and other monitoring programs collect data about monarch butterfly populations. However, there's no one program that coalesces all this data, nor is there one program that uniformly collects data about both monarch butterflies and all relevant aspects of their habitat, including blooming nectar plants, in a spatially representative way. And because no one organization can possibly do everything, the MCSP is working on developing a monitoring framework that's meant to be both iterative and partner-driven. And this framework has two goals, and they are to simply, or as hard as this is, to monitor monarch populations and distribution through time and space, and to monitor monarch habitat availability, including milkweed density and relative abundance of blooming nectar plants through time and space. And before I get into the details of the framework, it's really important to acknowledge the many individuals developing this framework, and this is only the short list. And I think there's some of these people in that room. Right, so getting into the framework, what exactly is it? Well, the first step in monitoring monarchs and their habitat is developing a sampling scheme that will select sites in a way that accurately reflect conditions across the huge geographic range that monarchs occupy. So to do so, the MCSP is going to be employing a GRIT draw. And GRIT stands for Generalized Random Tessellation Stratified Draw. And I had to practice that several times before I could say it without stumbling. But I'm just going to say GRITs from here on out. So to imagine how a GRIT draw works, picture a grid laid on top of the U.S. And the GRIT draw selects points laid out in this grid in a spatially balanced way so that the points are neither too close nor too far apart from each other, and good coverage of the landscape is obtained. Furthermore, every point that is generated is assigned a priority ranking. Data from points with a high priority ranking are weighted more heavily in an analysis than monitoring data from points with a low priority ranking. And the advantage to this priority ranking system is twofold. The first advantage is that we can identify top priority sites and strategically focus on collecting data from these sites in order to maximize information gained. Recognizing, however, that monarchs occupy a large geographic range and that we may not be able to sample every priority site, the grid straw offers a second advantage. And the second advantage is that data can be contributed from virtually any location that meets study inclusion criteria. This means that anyone, for example, citizen science or a state monitoring program or some other monitoring entity who would like to contribute data from a qualified site can. However, the catch is that if the site has a low priority ranking, the data will not be weighted heavily in the final analysis, but the data can still be included and support generation of results. Now, a final element of the GRIT's design is that the U.S. landscape will be divided or stratified into different land use categories, reflecting the fact that monarchs will utilize milkweed and nectar plants across many habitat types. And for this study, we're evaluating monarch distribution and habitat quality in landscapes falling into 6 strata, including protected grasslands, unprotected grasslands, CRP lands, agricultural lands, right-of-way habitats, and urban and suburban spaces. So once sites are selected for this monitoring study through the GRIT straw, we'll employ a series of SOPs or standard operating procedures. And these are basically protocols for monitoring monarchs in their habitat. And currently there are 6 SOPs that are being tested. And where possible, the MCSP has built these SOPs and protocols from existing citizen science programs such as the MLMP or the Monarch Larvae Monitoring Project. And so just to quickly run through these, the first SOP deals with basically going out to a site, establishing it, ground truthing it, making sure that that site falls into the proper strata, be it right-of-way habitat or protected grassland, whatever it's supposed to be. The following SOPs deal with measuring different aspects of the habitat, either looking at presence or density of milkweed and nectar plants, or looking for adult butterflies or eggs or caterpillars. And then there are additional SOPs that deal with rearing monarchs to adulthood, which is optional depending on participant level of engagement, directions for how to manage data and enter it, and then a final SOP will be regionally applied based on where fire ants are present. Oh, and I just put this slide in here just to remind myself to again emphasize that the MCSP is not trying to reinvent the wheel here. We're working as much as possible to use existing monitoring protocols, and to note also that this program is really meant to be inclusive and iterative. There's no one organization that can do it all, and we're going to be relying on help and participation from other monitoring entities in order to collect all this data. So in order to test both the GRIT sampling scheme and the SOPs, the MCSP is currently, as we speak, conducting a pilot iteration of the program through a monitoring trial. And for this trial, the MCSP selected 3 national wildlife refuges, which are Neil Smith, Waubay, and Washita, and conducted 3 mini GRIT straws on the refuges and surrounding private lands. And I should really have a logo on here for the NRCS, which is helping us gain access to private lands on near the refuges. So again, thank you to the NRCS, and I apologize for not including that logo. And at these sites, biotechnicians are testing the SOPs across these strata, but because some of these refuges are really far away from urban-suburban locations, the MCSP is also collaborating with the Chicago Field Museum to test SOPs or develop SOPs in urban-suburban spaces. So before I show you some of the schematics from the right-of-way protocols for this framework, I'd first like to point out that these protocols are in pilot testing, and by design, they're currently set up to oversample to make sure that we capture all the variability present. So by oversampling, we'll be able to determine how much we can scale these protocols back in terms of sampling intensities for future field seasons, and we'll also be able to estimate how much time these protocols will take. So this is just to give you an idea of what these protocols look like for rights-of-way habitats in their current form. Here you can see a schematic of a roadside site, and each site has 16 plots, which are labeled here. And to monitor plants and monarchs, an individual or individuals would walk through each of these plots and record information about immature and adult monarchs, milkweed, and blooming nectar plants, and other landscape attributes. And so let's focus on one of these plots, taking 4 as an example. So here's a schematic of what it would look like walking through an individual plot. And you can see that an individual would walk through here, recording information about plants and monarchs that they encounter. They'd have a measuring frame, which is this dark blue frame that you see here, that they would place along the ground to help standardize their observations. And again, these images are not meant to scare you away. I'd again like to note that these protocols are being tested this summer, and they're likely more intensive than future monitoring needs are going to be prescribing. So what are the next steps for this monitoring framework? Well, after the summer, the biotechnicians will provide feedback on the SOPs, and the MCSP will evaluate the results, develop simplified SOPs, put together a national protocol framework, which is a document that will be released for internal and external review. In parallel, the USGS will be conducting a grit straw to expand it beyond these 3 refuges, but to look at a broader scale. We'll also be developing a website and a data entry portal so that different monitoring entities can access this information, collect data, and submit it. And in addition, we'll be reaching out to monitoring entities for their voluntary participation, and where possible, coordinating training to support networks. So if we overlay the long-term goals of the monitoring framework on the systems approach to conservation, we can see that the long-term goals, by gathering this information, will help support understanding of the status and trends of monarch populations over broad spatial extents, and identify factors that are driving these trends, be it limitation of milkweed, limitation of nectar plants, or some other landscape attribute. By engaging with lots of different monitoring entities, especially through citizen science programs, we hope to promote monarch conservation and data collection about monarchs. And finally, through time, collection of data will help inform local efforts on the efficiency and effectiveness of habitat restoration efforts. And as was mentioned by Dr. Knuffman in our last talk, before I move on to parting thoughts, it just behooves me to mention that there are currently efforts underway to coordinate monarch conservation on a tri-national level, which is pretty exciting. Mexico, the US, and Canada have each identified top research priorities at an international conference in Mexico in February. And they're discussing the possibility of coordinating monitoring efforts on a tri-national level, potentially through a grid straw covering portions or all of North America. So moving on to final parting thoughts, I just wanted to present a case study showing the current status of milkweed and its utilization by monarchs in the upper Midwest in right-of-way habitats. And this study was conducted by the UNMN Monarch Lab, including Dr. Karen Oberhauser and Kyle Kasten, who did the boots-on-the-ground surveying. And the data is not yet published, but a manuscript is being prepared. So I'll give you a preview of the findings. So what this study did was they randomly selected 500 sites within a 250-mile radius of Minneapolis, and this included the states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, South Dakota, and Iowa. And each of these sites was visited, and 5 50-meter strips of habitat along each roadside were monitored for milkweed species richness, milkweed density, and presence of monarch eggs and caterpillars. And other features such as adjacent land use and mowing were recorded. And of course, oh, sorry, I forgot to change the slide. Site widths varied. So the results from this study, and that's interesting. I don't know if you guys can see the picture, but it seems to be gone from this presentation. The results of this study is that milkweed was present on 60% of the roadside transects. And Asclepias syriaca was the most common species, but other milkweed species were present. And this can help provide some recommendations in terms of other milkweed species that might grow well on roadsides. Monarchs were observed on roadside milkweed, but at lower densities than in other habitats as compared with citizen science data. And this doesn't mean that right-of-way habitats have a lower utility for monarch conservation. In fact, they did find that amongst roadside habitats, monarchs were most likely to be present when adjacent land did not have habitat. So for example, if the road was next to forests or ag fields and there was milkweed present, there were more likely to be monarchs there. And so this suggests that when land is converted and monarch habitat is removed, monarchs may rely more heavily on right-of-way habitat. Oh, there's the picture. All right. So as mentioned from the previous talk, and unfortunately it's beyond the scope of the study in this talk to cover all the ramifications of incorporating milkweed and pollinator habitat into rights-of-way habitats, but it is important to note that there's a lot of research needed to make sure that right-of-way habitats serve as ecological sources as opposed to sinks. And so to guide future conservation recommendations, we need more studies on optimal milkweed density in right-of-way habitats, recommendations for mowing, effects of salts. The list goes on, and I think you're all familiar with it. And there is ongoing research in this area, so stay tuned. And I think, as mentioned from previous talks, there are some resources available in terms of best management practices. I know I heard the Xerces Society Federal Highway manuscript mentioned. So you can go to the Xerces Society website or the Pollinator Partnership website to get some more information on BMPs for maintaining pollinator habitat and right-of-ways. So we covered a lot of ground, and in summary, we talked about the monarch migratory life cycle and evidence for monarch declines through a population viability assessment. We discussed stressors that are likely to be causing these declines, including loss of breeding habitat from the U.S. landscape. And to mitigate declines, we covered population viability assessment recommendations, which are to elevate monarch overwintering populations to 6 hectares. And we can do this by adding milkweed to the U.S. landscape and making sure that there's enough habitat, including blooming nectar plants, to support monarch populations. But we need additional data from an integrated monitoring effort to guide these recommendations and support these analyses. And finally, we looked at a case study showing that right-of-way habitats can support monarch development and cover ways for right-of-way habitats to get involved through participating in the monitoring framework. So this monitoring framework that I discussed earlier, the National Protocol Framework, will come out towards the end of this year, early next year, and there will be protocols available online. So if any organizations are interested in participating in monitoring, those protocols will be available for download. There'll be instructions included in them, and there'll be a platform for uploading data. So I'd like to thank many, many individuals and many hands that went into working on this project through the joint venture, through the MCSP, the Chicago Field Museum, and of course I'd like to thank Iris Caldwell and the Rights of Way Habitat Working Group for this opportunity to present. And if there's time, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Holly. Looks like we have at least one question. We're getting the microphone. Yeah, there we are.
Holly, thank you for your presentation. My question is, since MCSP member Obenhauser did a project looking at highway rights-of-ways, are any members of your group looking at other kinds of rights-of-ways to see the potential?
Certainly, and I'm just going to go back here to this slide, which I know I didn't dwell on for too long. But this analysis looking at where we can add habitat to rights-of-ways is not just talking about roadsides, it's including railroad rights-of-ways, I believe power line rights-of-ways. So this large analysis looking at where habitat can be added is including these other types of rights-of-ways. And for this summer, for this pilot study that I talked about, we're only doing roadsides, but in 2017, when we roll out this monitoring framework on a larger scale, we would, I'm sorry, I'm flipping through too many slides here. So when you roll this framework out on a larger scale, we are going to be including power lines, again, those same ones that I mentioned, roadsides, railroads, all these other rights-of-way habitat in the grid straw.
Thank you. I'm sensing in this meeting here this week that other rights of ways are really interested in this potential for a lot of reasons. So I would hope you would extend the monitoring to some of those utility rights of ways too. But most important to me is, what's agriculture doing about all this? Are you talking to them about their potential? How will their activities change to help monarchs?
Certainly, and that's an ongoing discussion. So, for example, I mentioned earlier that we're working with the NRCS. Specifically, I'm involved with working on the monitoring framework itself, so making sure that we can get access to these private lands. And that is something that the NRCS is really taking a lead in terms of making sure that we can get in and do some monitoring in CRP lands, perhaps in croplands as well. In terms of working with agriculture itself, that's I think, as everyone knows, it's a big challenge in terms of communicating the message and finding ways that are going to be workable for all parties and all stakeholders involved. But that's ongoing discussion.
Did you have a question? Just in response to the agriculture question, MJV and a number of partners, including NWF, are part of the Keystone Policy Center's Monarch Collaborative that is includes a lot of large ag interests like the big corporations, but also the grower groups. That collaborative is active and continues to have these discussions and trying to put out some resources as well.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, those are also meetings that I've been attending as well. So I am trying to make those links between the ag groups and initiatives that they're putting into place and what we're trying to do with rights of way, because I see clearly there's a lot of overlap and adjacent lands where it makes sense for us to be aware of what each other are doing.
I'm just wondering why I don't hear about bike trails, because counties maintain bike trails, states maintain bike trails, and the federal government maintains bike trails. So there are lots of right-of-ways and lots of miles with bike trails.
Good comment. Okay, any other questions? Okay. Well, great. Thank you again, Holly. Appreciate your time today, and glad this worked out, that you could present remotely.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you. I'm not sure if I'm still on, but just thank you all. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to contact me.